interesting book, and it's got so many layers. So you're here for housing conference because you're a housing researcher, professionally, right?
Yeah.
And so why did a housing researcher want to write a true crime book about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really out of my usual set of interests, and also a little bit out of my comfort zone. So 20 years ago, when I was working on my PhD, which was on housing conditions in Parkdale, I was interested in the myth that people told about Parkdale, which was a stable middle-class suburb. But I walked around Parkdale, I lived in Parkdale, and there were industries and there were very small cottages. So clearly rich and poor and residential and industrial lived together. And I was looking for stories that illustrated that diversity and that potential conflict. And I came across this murder case, and I got completely down the rabbit hole. I read contemporary newspapers. I used contemporary newspapers a lot in my thesis. And by the time I was finished reading 7 newspapers from the period of Frank's shooting until Clara's acquittal, I had kind of fallen in love with Clara in a way, but also I kind of went, wow, this is a story that has such resonance, because Clara had grown up poor and not unusual circumstance and racialized, and her mother was a single woman, a white woman, and because Clara had so much notoriety, I was able to find where she and her mother had lived and where Clara had worked, and Clara's friends and Clara's words. And Clara was an unusual woman in a number of ways. She was certainly very exceptionalized in Toronto, but she also was a fully worked out story of a single mom who was trying to pay the rent and feed kids. And she had 2 daughters, and no man in sight. So to me, I was fascinated by the case, but I was also fascinated by how she made ends meet, how her work, sometimes as a tailor when she could get it, when she couldn't get work as a tailor, she worked as a waitress, she worked as a chambermaid in a hotel, she worked in as a servant in rich people's houses, and all of the money that she earned, she said that her dream was to own her own tailor shop and own her own house that her mother and her daughters could live in with her. And her struggle is very, some things have changed in 125 years, too much hasn't changed, and her struggle is very resonant today, I find. So to me, it's partly a story of a crime and a trial, but it's also partly the story of just stubborn survival, and that always interests me.
Yeah, I felt like it was a real love letter to Parkdale. I actually know Parkdale really well because my uncle lives in Parkdale, and I stayed with him for a while, Fuller Street.
Yeah.
And so I walked around all of there and like down Queen Street like a million times. I'm like, oh, this neighborhood, and it's a lot like the Wolsey neighborhood here, which is where I live now. And I was surprised that you said in the book that it was considered middle class area, because like when all my friends like in Toronto were like coming to pick me up, they said they were coming in the hood.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it kind of has that hood rep for like people that live in like Milton and Whitby and stuff, right? So yeah, so I don't know how well you guys know Toronto, that they're from Winnipeg, but yeah, it's like kind of like the Wolsey of Toronto, I guess you could say. So how do you think that the neighborhood has changed since this book to now?
Well, we lived in Parkdale for a long time. From when we first moved to Toronto in 1986, we lived on Springhurst, and then we moved back in 1994 and lived there until we left for Australia in 2003. So it is a neighborhood of stark contrast. I think it's always been a neighborhood of stark contrast. So even though the house that Frank lived in and died in was on the lake shore, and that's been torn down for the Gardner Expressway. There still are some very rich people, and there still are a lot of very poor people. But part of the lie that was told to justify policies of gentrification was that Parkdale was returning to this sort of entropic state of being stable and residential, but it never was stable.
It's always
and
been
residential.
mixed.
It's always been mixed, and there's always been conflict, and there's always been racism. And there, like in my book on Parkdale, the thesis, the Ku Klux Klan was active. The Ku Klux Klan
My uncle told me that.
was active in the 1920s. So that diversity's always been feared by some folks.
Well, it sounds like there was a lot of white flight out of Parkdale to like other areas. It sounded like.
Yeah, well, the Westwoods moved to Rosedale.
And Rosedale
which
was kind of like,
yeah.
let's go there instead, right?
Let's go there. We won't have to deal with this anymore, you know. So yeah, there's always been tension in Parkdale, and I actually I live in Hintonburg now, and I see that tension in Hintonburg and Ottawa. It's very similar to a lot of inner city neighborhoods where there's been a lot of subdivided houses for a really long time, and then the pressure to turn them into single family homes, when in some cases they've never ever been single family homes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, lots of really contemporary issues that are still relevant about housing.
Yeah.
Another thing that that you touched on, I think, is a real theme in the book is the role of gender and femininity and sexuality, and how they interact with race. So how Clara as a black woman is sometimes seen as too masculine, sometimes being a woman saves her. So what were your thoughts when you were researching? Did you find anything that was surprising in that area, or
Well, I mean,
a message on that?
you know, just to be clear about my positionality, I did feel a bit awkward as a white woman writing a story of a mixed race woman who was, in the censuses, doesn't appear as mixed race, or Negro was the word they would have used in those days. But man, when she's arrested, she's black, she's mulatto, which was, again, the term that was used for mixed race people in those days. I also felt a little uncertain about what gender I should use in talking about Clara, but when it comes down to Clara's words, Clara said that she dressed up in men's clothes and lived as a man in order to get better wages, because as her lawyer said at the trial, she could pass for male, but she couldn't pass for white, but she could get better wages as a black man than she could as a black woman. And the way that Clara described herself was as a woman who wore men's clothes for safety and to earn more money. So it's hard to look back from the 21st century and say, what was Clara's self-identified gender? What was Clara's sexuality? So again, Clara's sexuality, Clara had 2 children. They appear to have been by different men, or at least that's the way, like the reporting was very circumspect, you know, a lot of code words, but she had 2 children, no men, that there's no point where in the directories or anything she's living with a man. So she was a woman who was the primary breadwinner, and what's more, her mother was never identified as having been with a man. Her daughters, when they lived independently, well, I mean, one was very young when the trial happens, about 7 years old. One was 14 and been living away from home for 2 years. There's no sort of men that are described in their life. So these were women who were on their own, which again was seen as very weird in the 19th century, unnatural somehow, just being a single woman, let alone a single woman with a child. Yeah, I mean, just as I was writing the book, I was shocked again and again by how much hasn't changed, how much suspicion there still is about single moms and about people who don't identify clearly with one gender role. So as you say, Zilla, some of the newspaper reporters, there were 7 newspapers, some of the newspaper reporters were saying, oh, mannish, not comfortable with being a woman, therefore probably a maniac, therefore doesn't need any kind of motive, just a monster. There were others who were saying, in Clara's confession, which she said was a false confession that had been forced by the police, she said that she'd been sexually assaulted by Frank, that he tried to rape her, and in July or August, and she'd come back in October to get revenge. And so was she a poor innocent victim? Was she a monster? All of the kind of tropes that were at play there, like was she a rejected mistress? Was she an angry black woman? Was she a harlot? Was she a monster? Was she a ignorant black girl who had been trapped by the police? Every single trope just went into the blender, you know? Well, you would know better than me.
But
you know.
yeah, no, they were very familiar, those tropes. But it was interesting to me that the Frank was 18 when he died, I think.
Yep.
And she was 33.
Yep.
But there seemed to be this suggestion that there could have been a relationship, or
Yep.
I was thinking, but that's such a big age gap, and she's a mom with like, would she actually have been interested in an 18-year-old child?
There's
I found that very unlikely.
That there was a consensual relationship, and plenty of evidence that they hated one another's guts.
Yeah, like I mean, I would think she'd be more like, that's the privileged brat of a neighborhood that's getting my nerves more so than I want to have sex with him. But they seem to play this. The newspaper reports that you quoted seem to imply that she was like lusting after him for years. I'm like, he's a kid.
Yeah.
Her daughter is almost the same age, right?
Yeah, they talked about this argument they had when Frank was 13 and he just moved to Parkdale with his family, and Clara was 28, and they're like, and that's when the affair began. And it's like, no, they actually are yelling at one another. I mean, it's not a rom-com, it's not a meet cute.
Yeah.
He's 13, she's 28, and she clearly thinks he's an idiot, you know?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And reputation was such an issue too, right? So it sounded like the newspapers didn't really know, like, what, they didn't want to make him look worse.
Yeah.
But to make her look bad, they kind of have to make him look bad.
So there was a lot of damage control going on in that trial, and indeed I have this whole possible conspiracy theory that a big-time lawyer was hired as Clara's defense lawyer in order to just make sure that anything about sexual assault didn't come into the trial, let alone the sort of racial harassment that was clearly an everyday experience for her, thanks to the Westwoods.
Yeah, they weren't the nicest family.
They weren't the greatest neighbors, no.
And then policing, you touched on that. That's obviously still a hot topic. It's something I deal with a lot professionally. What did you find about policing in late 1890s Toronto?
Yeah, I guess that was the biggest shock to me writing the book, that the police really were held in contempt in Toronto. Not like today, where, you know, any criticism of the police, let alone talking about defunding the police, is just seen as this complete, you know,
antisocial.
Say that, yeah, like right beyond the pale. So Toronto police came really directly out of something called the Orange Lodge, which was a Catholic organization. It still exists in Eastern Ontario, right? That's its purpose is anti-Catholic. It's an Irish Protestant organization. Orange was the color of William Orange, who massacred a bunch of Catholic people in Ireland. So all of the cops, and in fact most of the mayors of Toronto, but all of the cops were members of the Orange Lodge, and there was some definite Orange Lodge shenanigans between there is an obvious suspect. He's called the Bad Hat in the chapter that's about him, and there does appear to be an attempt to keep him out of it, very much because he's from an Irish Protestant family, from a prominent liberal family, and the cops were they weren't impartial. But the jury, you know, the police had a bad reputation, or at least the Globe, you know, which still exists today, was doing a lot of making fun of the police, and there were a lot of, you know, again, white middle class men saying, well, the police are just scum, you know. So it was really interesting.
I found
to
that
do that.
fascinating because I think now I think there's a lot of racial solidarity that builds behind the police.
Yeah.
So often as a person of color, criticizing the police, like most of the people that will push back on that are like often white men going, well, they keep us safe. Like this, and they're a lot more sort of solidarity. But I
Yeah.
found that really fascinating that they were saying, oh, these are a bunch of like ignorant, like uneducated boobs that don't know what
Yeah.
they're doing. So I'm like, so
Yeah.
when did that change? I think that would be really interesting to research because that's a big change.
Yeah.
And
And in
that
some
played a role, I
ways-
think, in her acquittal, right? That people
Yeah.
didn't believe the cops on the stand.
Yeah, and even when Clara was arrested, there were some lawyers, fairly mainstream lawyers, who were saying, you know what, the cops shouldn't have questioned her for 7 or 8 hours. The normal thing in those days was you arrested somebody, you put them in jail overnight, and the very next morning they'd appear before the magistrate, and the magistrate would either give summary judgment or hold it until trial if it was, you know, something like a murder, big crime. But in this case, the police questioned her for a total of 8 hours. She was first stopped at 3:30 in the afternoon in her workplace, and then her confession was at 11:30, and it was only at that point she was arrested. Like in those days, you didn't have a right to counsel, but you did have the right to call in a family member or a friend. It doesn't appear she was ever given that opportunity to call in a family member or a friend. And from the first moment of that confession leaking, which is basically the day she appeared, the next day when she appears at the magistrate, there's a lot of questioning about the police. And these days, you know, holding someone for 24 hours or 48 hours without, you know, laying charges and questioning them quite closely would be more of the norm, albeit with the right to have a lawyer there.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been any big deal today. So it was interesting because in some ways you can see some things about Clara's case are more progressive than today, like what you just said, how police were really limited in their questioning powers, and her testifying on behalf of herself and getting acquitted, that's extremely rare. Most judges would be like, are you nuts? But then in some ways we've advanced a lot too.
Well,
so
she had a totally shithouse judge too.
Yeah.
There's that.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. So I don't know what you saw as like some ways that we have advanced since then.
I mean, we tend
Where's
to
the
think
hope in the
things
Yeah.
have gotten better. You know, we always have this myth that things get better over time, and actually sometimes things get worse for the people's rights.
Yeah, in some ways, but then in some ways I think there are some points of maybe hope and advancement in some ways.
Absolutely. I don't want to sound totally cynical. I mean, I think if Clara was alive today, hey Mark, Clara would have more opportunity to openly be the person that she was.
Mhm.
Now, you know, it's really hard in the 19th century to say Clara definitely had a suit of men's clothes. She didn't have many clothes. Was she more comfortable living in men's clothes, living as a man? It's something that
We'll never know.
we'll never know, but we might be able to know now. So in that way, things have gotten better.
Yeah, definitely that aspect. I thought it was really interesting too. We've talked a little bit about the media, their role in national myth building, and some of the, like you said, the tropes and the myths and the stereotypes and the stories they were telling. Can you say something about that?
It was wild. It was wild. So the main source of Clara's story is a journalist who was 23 at the time. His name was Hector Charlesworth, and he wrote his memoirs in the 20s, so 25 years after the case. And in his memoirs, he's just so overtly racist. But also, he said in his memoirs, well, sometimes I published fakes, but sometimes I actually wrote the truth. I'd like that. So
Not all
he
the
was,
time.
Yeah, he was pretty upfront that he was a lying liar from Liarland, and you know, sort of the Fox News of 1895, and one of the, I mean, like he's a utterly reprehensible person, but he was really trying to raise, there were 7 newspapers, they're all engaged in this circulation war, and he's trying to get the World, his newspaper, to win the circulation war. So he pulls all these really hilarious stunts, like about a week after the murder, he sends a sheaf of these newspaper clippings to author Conan Doyle, who is at the height of his popularity then, because he just killed off Sherlock Holmes. Mind you, he revived him. He became a corpse reviver after that. But anyhow, he sends off this package saying, "Sir, what do you think?" And author Conan Doyle said, "I have no idea." And you know, it's the days of mail, so it takes about 3 weeks for that to happen. And then the headline of the World is, "Even Sherlock Holmes is confirmed." And much as I hate Hector Charlesworth, that really makes me laugh. But he was the person who did the 2-day in-depth. Some scientists are talking about homo-sexuality, and it turns you into a monster and you don't need a motive. So he was going bananas in the let's hang Clara for the sake of circulation wars. But at the other end, the Telegraph, which later became the Toronto Sun, not a bastion of progressive thought in Toronto, but the Telegraph just decided that they were going to uncover the real story. And so 3 of the reporters actually testified on Clara's behalf in the trial, saying that the route that she'd taken back from Parkdale on the night was couldn't have happened because it was underwater. So not only did all the newspapers have a different opinion and very much back that opinion, but also they inserted themselves in a way that's really kind of fun, actually.
Yeah, they weren't just reporting the news, they were giving a lot of commentary.
Yeah, no, they definitely saw themselves as detectives, as actors in this trial.
Mm-hmm. I guess they were, like you said, kind of like the commentators on Fox News or wherever that, you know, like Larry King or whatever, and they come on and they have their comments, or in CNN, or
well, it wasn't a 24-hour news cycle, but
it's kind of like the version of that. Yeah,
they would get in like a special edition on any occasion. In fact, and again, you know, it's not a spoiler that Clara is acquitted. So she's acquitted at about 11:30 at night, and she's walking the 4 blocks back from the courthouse, which still exists on Adelaide Street, back to her lodging house. And as she's crossing Yonge Street, there's this Star reporter coming out with a special edition saying Clara freed, and someone hands her the newspaper. So it is a little bit 24-hour news.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I noticed as a Black Canadian, that one thing that has not changed at all was that there was a lot of tendency to compare Canada to the US favorably. So, you know, we're racist, but they're worse. Like the guy, I think there's a guy you mentioned that was a Black guy that was charged with sexual assault, and they go, well, if he was in the States, he'd get lynched.
Yeah.
So, like, that's a mastery of dog whistling, right? Because you're like, hey, you guys, like, he should be lynched, but we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And that has not really changed at all.
No, and the whole thing about you should be grateful for, you should be grateful you're in Canada, it's just like, man, it's all over the globe reporting. It's like, we're being very noble here, but it's a good thing that she isn't in the US.
Yeah.
That would be terrible kind of thing.
That came up a lot, it seems like.
Yeah, it came up a lot. So there's this little, like, I kept on going into these side anecdotes, but there was a trial of a Black man who had come from Mississippi, and he'd sought basically refugee asylum status because he'd been involved in an altercation with a streetcar conductor who beat his son, and it was Georgia, and he'd managed to escape to Canada because he was positive, and he's probably right, that he would have been lynched. And he gets funding, and there's a big trial. This is just before Clara's case. And then there's this big sort of rally to raise funds afterwards, and a guy who, a preacher who a black preacher who came up from Hamilton, was refused accommodation in a hotel. And that doesn't get any coverage except for one mention where he tried to sue the hotel afterwards, but it's like, ooh, we're number one, we're so much better than the US.
It doesn't fit the narrative, so they don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, the hypocrisy was pretty thick.
Yeah, and I know there was that whole expression, Toronto the good, right? Mm-hmm. So that really sort of came to mind, that they really did think highly of themselves. Yeah, like in terms of the writing itself, like we talked a lot about the material, but I found this was so beautifully written.
Thank you.
So there were so many moments that were like almost like fiction. Like I'm trying to see if I could find. I think when you talked about when she received the news about the acquittal, the way you wrote that.
Well, I mean...
Oh, yeah, you said, just what you just said, just before young, the crowd came across a newsboy selling a special edition of The Star. Someone handed Clara a copy, and she read, "Set free by electric light. If I could stop this narrative to take a photograph of Clara, it would be in that moment."
Yeah.
I thought that was so beautifully told that we kind of got the sense of, like, you as the writer and the researcher, how the story affected you. We get maybe a little bit of her feelings. We get the sense of the street. So how much writing have you done? Like you said, you've written a book on housing. What else have you written?
Oh, Zilla, this was such a stretch for me, and I was really, really lucky in my editor, whose name is Leslie Erickson. I went to UBC Press because I know the owner of UBC Press, and I knew that they were trying to publish stuff that wasn't just strict academic stuff. So I've written 4 books before, and they've been pretty, like I was an academic, I was a professor, so they were written in a really academic style. And I said to her, I want to write 2 books. The second one's coming out next year, and I don't want to write like an academic anymore. Please help. It's like, the first step of the 12-step program. My name is Carolyn, and I'm an academic writer. So I had a really helpful editor, and I did basically 3 drafts to kind of, partly I do have this tendency to just want to jump down rabbit holes and go, what is it like to do laundry? What is it like? Why does everyone have a gun? That kind of thing. So I kept on getting curious about everything, and she kept on writing CBC, and I'm like, does she think that the CBC would be interested? And she said, could be cut.
I did notice that the guns actually, like a lot of people had guns in Canada back then.
Yeah, like
it's
everybody
like
in the
States.
story has a gun.
Yeah, that's a cultural shift that's happened.
That is a cultural shift that's happened.
But back to the writing thing. Like I guess.
Back to the writing thing. One editor, one publisher I ended up not going with said, "Could you write it as fiction?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I can't write it as fiction. I'm not that kind of thinker." But I did want to write it as a story. I wanted to be a storyteller. And with Parkdale book that I wrote, it's a little bit storytelling, but this was like, I want to tell the story. I want to tell Clara's story as best I can from the distance of time, and also all of the privileges that I have, like a different social situation from Clara. And I'll be honest, I'm so proud of myself that I was able to do that.
Oh, you definitely 100% succeeded, because it does very much come across as a story. I was actually thinking too bad she found her first, because I would totally write fiction about this.
I know.
I think she it would be such a great novel. But it's
I want
great
people
like
to
this
write
too.
Fiction of this.
Yeah.
I want people to I want someone to write a musical of this. The person who interviewed me in Ottawa at the launch, she's a playwright, and we started shipping characters.
Oh, that'd be great.
Who's Clara with?
It could be
and
great
I said,
as a play
Clara's
too.
with Eliza. They have started a relationship in the rooming house, and tell me what happens next, kind of thing. I want that to happen, actually.
It's great for that. So that doesn't surprise me that will probably. I would not be shocked to see that on a stage, and
I hope so.
It could totally be a novel too.
I kept on, when I was writing it, I was like, Janelle Monáe is Clara.
Absolutely. That would be perfect. I don't know if anybody had any questions or comments that you guys wanted to make. Yeah.
I do have a question, actually. Yeah. I had wondered about, you mentioned that Clara was one of the first people to testify in her own defense. And particularly interesting in that, of course, is that she is not only that the second person in Canada to testify in their defense is possibly homosexual, definitely a woman, and almost certainly not white.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder why that, and I suppose part of this might be for you, Zilla, as well, is does that not set a legal precedent moving forward in Canada about how and who can express themselves in sort of legal language and in legal courts?
Well, I do mention that until the 40s, the Ford case was used as a precedent about how the police should act very carefully when they're getting confessions. Testifying on her own behalf was really the only thing that was going to save Clara from being hanged, because she had given a very detailed confession that frankly is backed up. Her own daughter testified against her. Her best friend testified against her. So the only thing that was going to save her is not just taking the stand, but taking the stand with an awfully good story. And she delivered. She delivered. It was, as I write in the chapter, it was a performance of her life.
Yeah.
She saved herself. So I guess the precedent was, first of all, the police should tread a little bit more carefully, and they definitely treated her different because she was black. And also that when all else fails, you might as well testify on your own behalf. Although the first person who testified on his own behalf had actually been acquitted. It was a triple murder, and he'd been acquitted in the first murder, and then once he testified, he was convicted and hanged on the second murder. So that didn't work out too well for him. His name was Charles Lucky, and I said, bad choice of name there, not so lucky.
Yeah, because at this time, like, it was death penalty, so messing up wasn't just going to jail, it's your life. So there was tons at stake.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I guess to add to that, I think in some ways it was easier for her to testify in her defense than now. I think that's one of the ways you might have gone backwards, because they had a lot of things happening in court that you can't have now. The whole character witness thing, right, where you could bring in people to go, well, she doesn't have a bad temper, and I've never seen her get mad. That would not be allowed in court now as being irrelevant and prejudicial and hearsay and oath helping and all those things. But back then, I guess that was common, that you could bring people to say you're a good person and would never do this. And I think she benefited from some of that ambiguity, right? Because people weren't really sure how to place her, because was she, what do you make of the men's clothes? I think there was some real genuine confusion about that, like if she was just wearing it for safety or whether there was something more to it. And she was racially ambiguous, right, because her mom was white, so I think there was some sort of question about like where she fit in. Like her daughters they said something like, well, they look like they're white. They don't pass for white. And those are her kids, so kind of like, well, if she's got these pretty white girl kids, maybe she's not that bad. So I think there were a lot of kind of these kind of tropes that benefited her as well that now would not be in the courtroom. So it's kind of an interesting, like how would that play out now? It's hard to say, right?
The very fact that she'd worked pretty consistently from the age of 12 to the age of 33 when she was arrested was seen as proof of her good character. And again, it's just this sort of...
Because she had a job. So now they'd be like...
19th century stereotypes that, a good, hard-working person couldn't be a degenerate and kill someone. But mind you, the person who kept on getting in jail, the white guy, also a former neighbor of Frank, who kept on getting in jail, he somehow gets off from murder, so... Anyhow.
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. So I think it would be fascinating to see how that would happen, because I think in some ways it's going to be harder for an accused because the court rules are so much more strict than the rules of evidence. It sounded like the lawyers half the time were just kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and they were just going on reputation and well, this lawyer, like, he won this trial, so he must be good. And I don't know how much they were actually, like, the Crown didn't sound terribly prepared from their book.
The Crown was terrible. The judge was terrible. Like, I'd be, my brother's a criminal lawyer, I was telling Zilla, and, I kept on reading out bits of that, and I'm like, so that judge is bad. bad, right? And you're like, yeah, that judge is bad.
Yeah, he was very biased because it sounded like from what you said that everybody at the end of the trial, each lawyer gets to do their dress-a-jury, right? So the prosecution did theirs, defense did theirs, and the judge comes in and goes, actually, like I just want to add this and add and he started giving like his own opinion, and then the defense actually had to ask him to retract some of it.
Yeah, he
So that would
sent the
not
jury
happen
off
today.
without
Yeah.
like defining reasonable doubt, which even in the 19th century you kind of need to do. Yeah, he was a bad guy. Yeah.
But I think they were there because of their family name, or they were from the right family, or the right background, right? Like there wasn't the same
Well, he was a really good property
merit.
Right, it's like he was a chancellor, like a property rights specialist, and he actually, this is John Alexander Boyd, he's responsible for the Catherine Mills judgment, which set Indigenous land rights back for at least 100 years. So he's a bad man, but he did not want to be doing a criminal trial. And at one point, like the jury have a choice between stopping in the middle of Saturday afternoon or going on until Monday, and Boyd's like, let's end it. You know, yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And then there was a connection to the Louis Riel trial, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Here in Manitoba, maybe you can let.
So
As we know what that was.
the prosecutor who'd actually been hired, he was like a hired gun, B.B. Ostler, the most famous trial lawyer of the day, he was the guy who was MacDonald hired him to prosecute Riel, the only man ever executed for treason in Canada, and of course a complete injustice. But his wife died in the middle of the trial and he had to leave, and the guy who took over, who later became the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, was no, shabby guy. He was a pretty bad guy. Lawyer. He was a bad lawyer. Anyhow, sorry, there must be other questions. I can just do this all night.
Yeah.
I've got one. I'm interested in your thoughts about the true crime genre, because your book sort of fits within, and I was wondering if you had felt any tension, because it seems like one of the tropes of true crime is, finding alternate suspects or alternate explanations for the crime, and I wonder how much of that you did, and if you push back against that at all, because it really seems like you're fascinated with Clara as a person, which is...
It was a tension, Utaka, because I'm a social historian, and I was writing a murder mystery partly to soften the social history. But having said that, there's some, like The Devil in the White City, and there's a few other true crime books that I feel really encapsulate a lot of the history of the time really well. So I think that a murder kind of draws people in to the era really well. I mean, I love mysteries and I love true crime, so it was always going to be the way that book was going to be written. It was going to start with a murder, and then it was going to follow along to the trial.
Anyone else have comments or questions?
Related to that,
Yep.
book recommendations, like what's within the genre of crime and mystery. You talked about being someone who appreciates the genre. I'm always interested in hearing books that they love or that they would recommend, which I know puts writers on a spot. But.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give, there's obviously The Hanging of Angelique, which is, a really good book that takes this arson that burned down Montreal and takes it as an entry point to discuss slavery in Canada. So that's really important. But just last week, I was rereading a Nero Wolfe mystery called The Doorbell Rang. And I was thinking about it from the perspective of when it was written in 1960. And Nero Wolfe, who's like this detective in New York City and quite rich, actually takes on the FBI, including takes on J. Edgar Hoover. 1960. And in 1960, the Kennedys were still supporting J. Edgar Hoover's harassment of Martin Luther King Jr., etc. It was a kind of brave stance. And I think it's the first time that I was, I've read it a couple of times before. I like Nero Wolfe mysteries. It's the first time I went, wow, that guy, Rick Stein actually had some chutzpah in 1960 to do that. Good for him. Yeah. It's it really makes the FBI look bad, which I like. So even though it's an old-fashioned book in many ways, it hung up. It like I was rereading it last week and I went, this is still pretty good. Yeah, I like this. Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned the Hanging Angelique because that's a Fua Cooper's book.
Yeah.
And one of my projects actually is a collection of short stories about Angelique and different ways that the fire could have happened.
Oh wow.
So yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
I
that's
read about
another
her.
example of where there's someone who writes a straightforward history, but it does leave you with all these questions that can be explored better.
Like
in
who
fiction.
actually did it, right? Like
Yeah.
we will never know. So I have
Yeah.
a bunch of different possibilities.
Oh, I'm sure it
Yeah.
was the boyfriend, but anyway.
That's what I think. Yeah, that's kind of what I think, but who knows, right? Anyone else?
Well, thank you so much for showing up, and thank you so much. It was really great meeting you.
Yeah,
Zilla.
you too. Like
Yeah.
this is a really great book.
Well, I can't.
So I hope everybody will read it and enjoy it.
Zilla's working.
Great. Thank you very much,
Thank
Carolyn
you.
and Zilla. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.